Welcome to the Album Anniversary Podcast. Today's show is about American Idiot by Green Day. It was released September 21st, 2004, so it's celebrating a 20-year anniversary. Hi, I'm your host Caleb, or Caleb the Spy on Twitter and Instagram, and every day on those social media sites I post about what I call album anniversaries. And look, it's just the anniversary of the album's release date. If I don't know that release date, I've just picked a date on my calendar to celebrate that album. And that's really how this started. A couple years ago, I created this calendar to celebrate the release date of some of my favorite albums. But in the last year or so, the list of albums has grown significantly, and I now have over 2,000 albums tracked on my calendar. On this show, we take time to celebrate one of those albums that's celebrating a big anniversary, and I often focus on alternative rock and punk and my strange obsession with ska. In the 90s, I was super into the Christian music scene, so that'll come up on the show often, and I've always had a fascination with historically important albums or musical events. Today, I'm joined by Robert to answer 5 simple questions about American Idiot by Green Day. Robert, welcome to the show.
Hi, yes, thanks you so much for having me.
I'm excited you're here. We've gotten to know each other a little bit over not mostly, entirely online. At some point I think we will find a way to connect because you have moved slightly closer to me.
Yeah, much closer.
Yeah, well, much closer from California, that's for sure. So hopefully we'll have a chance to meet at some point in person, but I'm really excited to have you on the show. I like to start with kind of a little bit of, who you are and kind of how you got into music, and anyone who follows you on Instagram specifically, that seems to be where you're most active, knows that you're into music. So, in fact, to the point that you've made a career out of music because you work in radio. And so were you raised in a house around music, or is it something that kind of stumbled into later in life?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Robert, aka Robert Hawk, aka Green Hawk. That nickname was actually given to me by Mike Herrera himself. But not here to talk about MXPX. We're here to talk about Green Day today. Yeah, I guess a little bit of background on myself. I did grow up in a musical household. My mom, she teaches piano, she teaches flute, she teaches guitar. She was part of the worship team at our church. She's been a choir teacher for elementary grade students for years now. She's been super involved in local Broadway productions in her area. And she's the reason that I have such a high appreciation for music in my life, because I grew up in that world. So I was involved in choir and, plays and musicals and all of that kind of stuff. But while I was exposed to all of what I would call like Broadway music, stuff like Disney movies, Sound of Music, your basic worship stuff, she didn't really expose me to any secular or mainstream music. Watching Nick Jr. growing up and watching Disney Channel, I knew pop artists like Britney Spears and NSYNC, whoever Disney was pushing at the time, but I didn't really start listening to real music until I was in middle school, which would have been 2006, 2007.
Okay.
I went to a private Christian school growing up, so some of the first stuff that I listened to was Relient K, Switchfoot, Hawk Nelson, Family Force 5, Weird Al Yankovic, and Underoath. It was during those kind of years that I started, though, branching out, 2007 to 2009. Those were some very formative years for me. It wasn't until about 2009, though, that I discovered Green Day because of their song 21 Guns. That's how I ended up finding out about them, listening through 21st Century Breakdown, fell in love, went back, listened to all their albums. And that's kind of how I got to Green Day.
That's cool to kind of hear, I'm not going to lie, the Christian stuff is a lot of the engagement I get on social media is around that. Obviously, though, you have not stayed there. You've branched out a ton, not just Green Day, but you're super into the punk and the punk scene a ton, and even the emo stuff. Is that kind of where you ended up then musically?
Yeah, so I listened to a ton of punk rock, pop punk, everything. Honestly, I love ska music. That's the best music. You and I have both connected over ska. Yes. Our love of Five Iron Frenzy. I don't know. I listen to so much music. It's not just that, though. I know that's the stuff I'm really knowledgeable about, but even that, I sometimes feel like it's surface level because my knowledge of that doesn't match a lot of other people's. But then I also really love stuff like I love jazz. Like I
Hmm.
gotta have a real good jazz piece in there. Me and my wife have been really deep diving into disco this entire year. We've been doing a ton of research on disco, not
Okay.
just like the ABBAs and the Bee Gees, but like some real underground stuff that has not had any sort of light of day or mainstream knowledge. And it's some real wonderful stuff that we've been really digging.
Hmm.
So I really do listen to just whatever. There's stuff in every genre that I really love and that I really dislike, and I can name positives and negatives about every genre. I really try to branch out as much as possible. I just love music. I love learning about it so much.
So it's funny you mentioned the ska thing, and I know you've got a bit of a relationship with. Maybe I'm wrong, but you know Adam from Omnigon,
I
like
do, yeah.
personally. He's not. You're just not a fan. Like you actually have had some more strong connections with him. So he's. I really like having long hair, but I've always felt like it's not very punk, and so. I remember like when I was first introduced to them, I was like, "Oh, he's got long hair and he's super ska punk." And so I was like, "All right." So he's kind of my inspiration for actually growing my hair back out. Is was
I've asked
him?
him about that too. That's really funny because I have asked him about that. I'm like, so what are you gonna do? Are you gonna like shave it all off? Because his hair used to be really short, and then he's like,
Sure.
well, I just didn't know what to do with my hair, so I just let it grow out. Those are his words, and I'm saying them.
Well, that's good. I mean, you that is he has definitely been a inspiration that it's okay to just you can be punk and have kind of long. It looks like I'm really into like 80s metal, especially when I shave down the beard to just a goatee. I always look in the mirror and go, really looks like I just want to get in my convertible and drive down the street listening to Leonard Skinner. But it's not necessarily my thing. And but he inspired me to go for the long hair and give it a shot. My
That's
wife would not
awesome.
be happy. So
And Omnigon is just such a great band in general. Link 80, Omnigon, just all of it. Everything that Adam touches is
yeah,
super fun.
yeah, it's one of my big bummer. I was not doing vinyl back in 2019 when No Faith. Was it 2019? I think it was around then. Maybe it was a little after that, but I was not doing vinyl when No Faith came out. So I don't have that one on vinyl. I have those other two on vinyl, and that's one of the ones that I would love to try and find because I'm totally missed out on it. And they aren't selling it anymore because that's actually my favorite of the three. I think, although I have not spent enough time with Farrell to probably a strong enough opinion on it. So
Yeah, Feral is in my top 3 albums this year. Absolutely.
yeah, I'm really excited. I have not had the time to do the deep dive, but I'm excited to. So well, I'm glad you're here. Thanks for finally for thank I finally invited you. So I was gonna say thanks for finally joining the show. Like you've been avoiding it, you haven't. It's poor hosting, but I'm so excited to hear. With that out of the way, I say we dive into American Idiot.
Yeah, let's do it.
Don't wanna be an American idiot. Don't want a nation under the new media. And can you hear the sound of hysteria?
So again, we're talking about American Idiot by Green Day, again released September 21st, 2004. Some of the albums I am not entirely sure of the release date. I feel really good about that one because it's a big enough album where it's pretty easy to figure that out. This was the band's 7th album, and I'm really good with last names, but Rob Cavallo, I believe, that's how you say his last name. He's the producer of this album, and he had produced their last 4 albums. And I would argue he's probably one of the most successful producers in music history. He's got a huge Wikipedia page, tons of stuff. So that's kind of some of the basics about the album. Again, it was he had produced their last 4, and he is a huge name, Rob Cavallo. So a little bit of story about how they kind of got to this point. So Warning had been a bit of a disappointment sales wise, and then they had actually started working on an album, and then something happened with the master tapes. I think they were stolen, and so they kind of started over, and the focus was they were going to try and be a little more focused on the punk sound and less on what I saw described as folky power pop. That was kind of how they described Warning. So they did kind of try and refocus on the more punk rock sound when they got into the studio for this one.
Right. And I could totally agree with that kind of description for Warning. It was definitely more of a folky power pop sound than the punk rock that we knew and loved from
Yeah.
Insomniac or Nimrod or even Dookie. And those master tapes were stolen, and the working title for the album, I believe, was Cigarettes and Valentines.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yep.
It would have been cool to hear what those sounded like. You know, that there's one person out there in the world who has those master tapes, doesn't realize what they have. Hopefully they didn't throw them away or something. And they don't want to release it on Pirate Bay or something, you know, because then they can get traced back. And then but there's one person out there who knows exactly what that old sound sounds like.
Can't be a market for that, right? Because you get any way you try and sell that, the only way you're selling that is on the black market. And what kind of audience are you going to get on that? But
yeah, you're just admitting that you're a criminal.
So you got to wait for the statute of limitations to.
What I want to know is, how did someone get into the recording studio and get those tapes? Because most recording studios just look like a warehouse with maybe a swinging door.
And I would think a warehouse with all that equipment in there, pretty locked down. I mean,
right?
You don't just you don't want anybody just walking into most of the professional studios, especially them. They're a big band. They're not recording in some dinky studio.
Exactly.
So, the album is a concept album, and the members of the band have dubbed it a punk rock opera, which I think is a very, very good description of it. It follows the story of the Jesus of Suburbia, a lower middle class American adolescent anti-hero. The album expresses kind of a disillusionment and descent of a generation that came of age in a period shaped by the tumultuous events such as kind of 9/11 and the Iraq War. So I think that is part of the power of this album. We'll kind of get to it, of just kind of the timing of this post 9/11, post Iraq War, although the Iraq War is probably still going on. And so they kind of hit at the right time for a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, it definitely did. Especially, you can almost view this album as like a timepiece.
Yes. In my opinion, it all works, and we'll get to that later, but it's a huge comeback album for them. It produced 5 singles. I'm just going to read them. We'll get to them later. But American Idiot, Boulevard of Broken Dreams, Holiday, Wake Me Up When September Ends, and then Jesus of Suburbia, which is one of the rock opera songs, really. It's there's 2 9-minute songs, which, again, we'll probably make mention of. They released that as a single as well. I can't imagine that did very well on radio. 9-minute song, it's probably a bit of a tough sell, especially it was almost a year after the original release of the album, so it's probably a bit of a tough sell, but they technically did release that as a single as well.
Yeah, nowadays it's on the rock and alternative stations, and it's usually played at 11 p.m. or after, and it's just a filler song like, oh, we're 15 minutes behind schedule, let's just throw Jesus of Suburbia in there.
Just to fill it in. I like that idea of a filler track on the radio, because it's definitely not a filler track on the album. But
yeah,
again, it was horribly successful. It reached number 1 on the Billboard 200, and it has sold over 23 million copies worldwide. I don't know what level of platinum that is, but it's a big number, that's for sure. And it was also a critical success. Even Pitchfork, I found this really interesting. They gave it a 7.2, which, as Pitchfork goes for a fairly mainstream album, that's a pretty high rating, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting to also note that this is for the overall album. This is not for the American Idiot song, because the song did not chart in the United States. But you know where it did chart? In the United Kingdom and Canada.
That's funny. I didn't realize it didn't chart. I thought it was a big hit from the get-go. That's really interesting.
Just the song American Idiot did not chart in the United States. It hit, let me look here, 61 in the United Kingdom, and it hit number 1 in Canada. So I think they might have some sort of bias over there. I don't know.
That's hilarious. I never thought about that. That's crazy. Historically, even, I think people still remember this album very fondly. I go to it all the time because I find it interesting, the Rolling Stone top 500 album lists that they keep on pulling out. Not because I think they're necessarily great. There's some problems with them, but they're really good conversation starters, and I think they help you just get an understanding of the general feeling towards an album. So that's why I reference them. And in their 2012 list, this came at 225, and then in 2020, it moved further back a little, and it was at 248. So kind of remembered historically very well, and I'm sure there's plenty of people who put it very highly on an all-time favorite albums list and stuff like that. And then the last thing that I have is kind of a fun fact. I don't know how fun any of these are. I have heard, and then I think even after I wrote this note, I thought I saw something about something on their Instagram that they are releasing a 20th anniversary deluxe edition of this album, and I've heard a release date. I've seen a release date of October 25th. I have no idea if that's accurate, and no idea. I don't have a way to verify that very much, but there you go. There might be.
That is accurate. There is an American Idiot 20th anniversary super deluxe box set. It's got like a zillion vinyl discs, or it has like 4 CDs. They've been doing this a lot recently.
Yeah.
They did this with the Dookie 30th anniversary. They did this with the Nimrod 20th anniversary. I think that's what they were celebrating. I think that's what it was. But yeah, American Idiot's getting the good old Reprise Records classic rock treatment, where you're going to have to go buy the album again. And there's a bunch of extra content to it too. There's a live version of multiple songs. There's rarities that didn't make the final cut that were recorded for the album.
Interesting.
There's a documentary on the making of American Idiot, the documentary called Heart Like a Hand Grenade. There's a ton of stuff that's coming with this box set. And I think it does. Yeah, it's confirmed here on the Green Day website, October 25th, 2024.
There you go. Yeah, I was going to make a joke about like, there's no way they'll top the Dookie box set. Because I was thinking maybe that was the Weezer one. I got them confused because the Dookie one was at least 5. I want to say 5 vinyls. So
6 vinyl. Yeah.
6 was okay. Yeah. I was going to make a joke and then I was like, oh, wait, it's the same band. So that actually tracks that they're just doing this for a lot of theirs. So failure on my part to make a good joke.
To follow love and follow dad. To alcohol and cigarettes and Mary Jane. To keep me insane. Doing someone else's cocaine. And there's nothing wrong with me. This is how I'm supposed to be. In a land of make-believe. But don't believe in me.
On to our first question. You kind of touched on this a little bit, but how did you first discover this album?
So I first discovered American Idiot when I was really getting into Green Day. So that would have been 2009. So this was after 21st Century Breakdown released. What I used to do is I would find an artist I really liked, and then I would just download their whole discography. I did this with a lot of artists too.
Yes.
Back then I did it with like Mike Posner, Katy Perry, Lady Gaga. Eventually, I got around to Green Day. First time that I listened to American Idiot, I was in my bedroom. I was listening to it on my laptop. Totally changed my whole world of music.
Yeah.
It was like some of the first music that I can remember that had any sort of swearing in it. I put it on my little iPod Nano and I would bring it to school, and then I would go to the locker rooms and I would like hide away and I would listen to Holiday because it had the F word in it. And I wasn't really exposed to that sort of language before. And kind of looking back on it now, it's almost like I was getting like high off of listening to cuss words. But I mean, I really did just like fall in love with the whole album.
Yeah.
I fell in love with the story, and I continued to listen through their whole discography and just kind of fall in love with them as a band.
That's cool. I think there are a lot of us out there. I think I felt like I was alone, but I think there's a lot of us who do that, right? You hear an album, you get introduced to an album, and it clicks, and your immediate response is to run and go, well, what else is there? And some bands you can do it and it doesn't feel totally overwhelming. And then there's bands where you go and you look and you're like, oh, they have 15 albums out. Where I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
You got to go figure it all out. So I think I love that idea that
trying to get into Frank Zappa is a nightmare.
Yeah. The example I always use is Bob Dylan. If you've never listened to Bob Dylan, then all of a sudden he hits you. You're like, well, I got 40 albums to do. And some of them are clunkers. And I love Bob Dylan, but some of them are clunkers, and you need a guide through that look back. So
absolutely. But yeah, this is one of the quintessential Green Day albums to listen to.
Yeah, I think so. I was into it in 2004. So 2000, I think you and I'm quite a bit older than you, I think. So 2004, I'm living on my own. I'm out of the house, and I've actually just come back from being overseas for a couple of years. And I remember being really, really excited for this. Dookie came out when I was a freshman in high school. So that was my getting into, blowing up my worldview of music was actually Dookie 10 years earlier. And I had enjoyed Insomniac, I enjoyed Nimrod, I had enjoyed Warning. I had been a fan throughout. But, I'm in my mid 20s, and I'll be honest, I was spending a lot of time at that time with a very conservative Christian setting. I was going to a very conservative church, and it was 2004 was kind of this realization of how different my musical taste was, because I can tell you right now, there's other albums probably, but I know the two albums that I was probably most excited for in 2004, well, the three ones was, Five Iron released their live album, The End Is Here. Roper did his Brace Yourself for Mediocre, and then this album were probably the three biggest things, and everybody else around me is like into Shane and Shane, and I'm, kind of dealing with the breakup of Five Iron and loving these kind of punk rock albums. And then also, things like Switchfoot and even Radiohead. That was when I was starting getting big into Radiohead, and even like the Foo Fighters. And even though none of those bands had releases in 2004, that's kind of where I'm at. And I remember feeling that like tension of like, nobody I'm hanging out with is listening to these albums. So that's pretty distinct memory for me. And in fact, I remember having to convince one of my longtime music friends of like, hey, no, this album is good. I know you're not a huge pop punk guy, but you've got to check this album out. It's so mind-blowing where they went on this. So I was into it from the start. I remember getting it, I think day one, actually going to Best Buy when you still bought CDs and getting it. So that's kind of my introduction to this album.
Yeah, it's definitely iconic too. And I think being into bands like Relient K and Hawk Nelson and that kind of Christian contemporary pop punk stuff, I feel like that laid the sprinkle dustings of how much I would actually click with this.
That's interesting, because you kind of had those sprinkle dusting. That's a good way of putting it. Like, you kind of had this breadcrumb to this. Where like Dookie, I did not have that. It was like I was listening to Petra, and Steve Taylor was probably the closest thing. And then this came out, and I remember, what's the lead single off that? Basket Case. I remember just hearing it on the radio and being like, what is going on? And what is this? And, this is one of the first CDs, if not the first CD I ever bought. And my parents were not super thrilled about it, but it blew my mind.
When I started getting into this kind of music, I just kind of stopped talking about what I was listening to with my parents.
It came up on my other podcast, my youth group podcast, about what happened when my parents found this album, and I'll leave that story for that podcast. It's a better connection. I can tell you off the air, just because it's a funny story in my opinion.
My parents both know that I listen to Green Day. They both are aware of the name and the band Green Day. I don't think they know what American Idiot is. I can almost promise you that neither of them have heard a single song from this their entire lives.
I'm sure that's the same for my parents as well. All right, let's jump into our next question. And I know we've started touching on this a bit, but, why do you love this album?
So what I love the most about this album is a very, I don't know, it's kind of a complex question, honestly. There's a lot to love about it. But if I were to narrow it down to kind of one point that kind of branches out, it would be just the amount of history that is carried around this album. The story of how Green Day was working on it, with that working title, Cigarettes and Valentines, the masters getting stolen, and instead of trying to re-record that album, they created American Idiot. The political aspects to it are very fun, if that's a right word to use. Obviously, the band leans one way, and they exclaim it very well throughout this record. But I really think it is fun for any political affiliate, because it's just kind of that bare minimum. It's a little that way, but, that's how that goes. I also really love that it sparked an entirely new generation of Green Day fans. The teenagers that discovered Dookie that were old, they were older, and the kids of the 90s they were becoming fans of American Idiot. They were becoming fans of Green Day, and it spawned like a second tsunami wave of people that were to love Green Day. And I really loved that. As the years go by, sure, some of the references like watching Spike TV, that's kind of dated now, but we continue to learn more details about this era, this recording process. The longer it's been released, the longer we're spending with Green Day, and the longer Green Day's been an active band. And so I really love the history that encompasses this record.
I like that description of the political part of it being fun, because I think that's a really good description, because the politics of this are engaging. There's no way around it. And I think they're not overly complex. I will say sometimes they're a little they're not, I don't want to say overly simplified, but they are simplified down, but that makes sense. And it made them very, very digestible. And especially in a place where, in my opinion, politics are just no fun anymore, this at least had some playfulness in it. And they ask a lot of really good questions. They push a lot of really good issues that I think are good for people to think through. So that's a great way of putting it, that the politics were fun, because I was thinking about it as like digestible. So I think that's a really, really good description of it. Musically, I think it's brilliant. It's so catchy at so many turns, and it feels a little edgy. Like, it's not totally mainstream. It's still, it's pop punk, but I think musically it's just an absolutely brilliant album. There's almost no part of it musically that doesn't work, in my opinion. And I think it's pretty amazing, because they had struggled a little. We talk about Warning not selling well, and it was kind of a different sound, but to go back into this musically and just nail it, I think is pretty amazing.
I feel like that also has to do with how simple these songs are. They're not overly complex. They're very basic chords, very basic chord progressions throughout the record as well. So it's easy to follow along, whether you're really into music or not. And it's really easy to follow along if you're just learning to play the guitar or just learning to play the bass. None of these are overly complex parts, but they work so well together. And then in songs like Jesus of Suburbia, where it switches up tempos and switches up so much 5 times throughout the song, it's still cool. Even if you're just listening to it to learn the lyrics, it's cool to know all the lyrics to a 10-minute song.
Yeah. Those 2 10-minute songs, or 9 to 10-minute songs, I know that, one, Jesus of Suburbia got released as a single, but in my opinion, I think those songs kind of highlight how brilliant this album is, and how it's a big swing. Like, they took a big swing and they nailed it, in my opinion. Like, the rock opera part of it feels very real. And I feel like those 2 songs, for me, the way I would describe them is they're the heart of the album. Like, the other parts of it are there, and it all holds together really well. I love that it has an overarching arc. But for me, the idea of like these 2 9-minute punk rock songs that are just the essence of this album is, I've never seen anything like that since, and I don't know if you ever will.
And that's also what helped inspire the Broadway production of American Idiot, which is really interesting in and of itself. Have
you seen it?
I have seen it. I have seen it live, and I'll tell you right now, it kind of sucks. But I always have to preface, it as a musical, as a Broadway production, it kind of sucks, but the music's really good. But I'm biased because it's all Green Day music. But it is really interesting going and listening to the American Idiot, the musical soundtrack, because that is the soundtrack that they use. And it's really weird to go from American Idiot songs and splice that in with songs from 21st Century Breakdown. But the stories are so similar, and yet they work so well together, and it made for a good musical. It made for something really entertaining that I was willing to pay money to go see. It was really cool to see all that, and it was really cool to see their depiction of the punk rock outcast in a professionally musical setting, where it totally missed the mark, and yet it totally nailed it on the head. It's super weird. I think all the reasons I've said have been the reason why it hasn't been on Broadway since, but it's interesting, especially because on that, they also use the bonus tracks that aren't included on the standard edition of American Idiot. They use bonus tracks from the record in the Broadway production. So, but yeah, songs like songs like Jesus of Suburbia, you know, obviously you have to start it off with American Idiot
Yeah.
and then go into Jesus of Suburbia. And it works. And it works so well for a rock opera. And then being Homecoming, being like almost the closer is so good and it's so brilliant. And honestly, I think Homecoming is the better of those two songs. It's more fun, it's more edgy, it's like the final like big number of the album, and it just feels more full and energetic. And then you get What's Her Name afterwards, which is kind of like an epilogue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love that the ending. I mean, we'll get to it. Well, we might get to this. If we don't get to it, I'll put it in now. I think I like What's Her Name. It's a fine song, but I kind of wish they would have ended the album with Homecoming and that list of 5 songs. And you know, it's their album; they can do what they want. But it almost feels like because We're Going Home is kind of how that ends. And yeah, I think it would have been just a beautiful way to end the album. But you know, I'm a big fan of the epic closing track, so I always got to mention it in every album I cover.
Well, that's due to your 5 Iron Frenzy love. I know that for a fact.
It is, and we dissected this did a show about Newsboys Going Public, and I think that was my first album that had one of those. So there's 2 albums that like really, and they're both Steve Taylor related. Going Public by Newsboys has LEG as its closing track, and it feels a little epic. But then Squint by Steve Taylor has Cash Cow as its ending, and it's this just beyond weird. And I think that's what introduced me to the love of crazy ending tracks that I want to see. So
yeah, Homecoming, I can totally see why it should be the last track, and I totally understand that. In my brain, when I'm listening to What's Her Name, it's almost like, well, we went home. You know, we left the hometown, we did our thing, and we learned a lot and we grew a lot as a person. It's almost like if you've ever seen the movie SLC Punk. It's like he's still stuck in his hometown, but he's got a lot of growing up to do.
Sure.
And he finally grows up at the very end. And then What's Her Name is the epilogue, where he's roaming around, or whoever the titular character of the American Idiot story is walking around his hometown, and he's like, oh, I remember her. What was her name again? And it's just kind of like reminiscing of a time that once was of your youth.
Yeah, it almost feels like the, you know, to stick with the rock opera, like the cast is coming out and waving goodnight, and you know, people are kind of mingling out. I feel like that's maybe how What's Her Name fits in. You know, it's kind of the show's done, but they're still we're gonna have some nice cheerful. It's because a fairly cheerful sounding song, even if the lyrics may not always be. But you know, so yeah.
I walk alone, I walk up. My shadow's only one that walks beside me. My shadow heart's the only thing that's beating. Sometimes I wish someone up there will find me.
I know these questions kind of tend to cross over, and we've already touched on a little bit. You know, why does this album hold up for you, or why, if it doesn't hold up for you, or if it's not important to you, you know, why is it still something that is? We've used the word iconic. What is it about that makes this iconic, or makes it just hold up for you and still be a personal favorite?
So why this album is important to me is a very tricky question to answer, because this is a really like personal, you know, this is really personal. It's not like I'm trying to write a review online for the masses to get them to listen to it. So why it's important, I guess it's because it helped shape my musical career. It gave me like an appreciation for rock, punk, and pop punk, with or without me knowing it. You know, we said it. Reliant K and Hawk Nelson did the Sprinkle Trails. This is the album that gave me the groundwork for what was to come in my musical journey of discovering and loving music. You know, if it wasn't for American Idiot, I might not love Blink-182 as much as I do, or Neck Deep, or The Story So Far. And as I kind of reflect on this album, it reminds me of a time in my life when I was self-discovering. Like I was learning how the outside world worked, outside being, you know, outside of the church, outside of the private Christian school, outside of the parental bubble that I was in. And I was figuring out kind of who I was, what my values in life were, and kind of how to approach things. So do I still think this album holds up? Yeah, I really do. I think it holds up just as well today as it did 20 years ago. 20 years ago, it was clearly about the Bush administration,
Yep.
the war in Iraq. And, this summer they've been playing it in full on tour, clearly against the current political climate. And
Yep.
sure, there's a few dated references on the record, but for any like teenager who's full of angst or anger and is trying to just kind of figure out how the world works, it still hits for that audience, and it still sticks with those people, and it sticks with them for life, even after you've grown out, if that was a phase or if that's your lifestyle or whatever walk of life you're in. If that was a quintessential part of your life, you still love American Idiot. And it's really cool to be like walking around the mall if you do that and see teenagers still rocking out those American Idiot t-shirts that they got from Hot Topic. It's just really cool to see that it's just an album that's just stuck around. Or
Yep.
who knows? Maybe the American Idiot t-shirt is becoming the new Dark Side of the Moon t-shirts.
I think Nirvana first. I think Nirvana has become
Yeah.
that.
Nirvana, Guns N' Roses, Blink-182 t-shirts are now available at Target for $12.
Yeah.
Next up, it's the American Idiot logo.
Yeah, it'll get there, sadly, if it hasn't already. Yeah, I think it did. It struck a chord with so many people. I think that is part of the reason it does hold up, and you can still sing it today, and it still can relate to the current political climate. I mean, I think the frustrations that people felt in 2004 that I know this awakened in me, I still feel today, if not stronger. And I think it absolutely struck a chord. I want to say it is cynical at times, but you mentioned it's still fun and it's still consumable, and I think that's why it's had a lasting effect. It's pop friendly and it's not so alternative that it drives people away. And so I think it is, walked that balance really, really well. And for me, even though I was older, or like I was, post college, I was living on my own, this was a formative young adult album for me, where it was like, because it does feel even a little more mature than, say, Dookie. I mean, even the name alone, right, feels a little more mature. And so it was a good album for me as a young adult to kind of be like, I'd grown up very much in a Christian home, and it was very much kind of out on my own and kind of starting to think through some of those things differently. So I think that's why it still holds up for me, and why I think it is iconic is a really good word for this album.
Absolutely.
Dreams lost and found, city bound in my dreams, and screaming, and
All right, it's been hard to talk about this album without mentioning some of these tracks. So I'm going to jump into the favorite tracks question. Are there tracks that we haven't talked about that you feel like need to be called out, or just, your favorites on this album? And it's hard not to say all of them, I know.
Right. Well, that's literally what I'm thinking this entire time is favorite songs. Oh gosh, like the whole album, it just works so well as a unit. Like
Yes.
every time I'm in the mood to listen to one of these songs, more than likely I'm going to just hit play on the first track and listen to it from front to back, because it is one of those albums. It's a no skip album.
Yeah.
And while there are songs on there that I'm not as big a fan of, like I really like fast, upbeat music. I'm not really into like the slow stuff, even though I can appreciate it. And there's a time and place for slower songs. Those are usually my not so favorite ones. But like, I really love Holiday. Not just for nostalgic reasons, not just because I was listening to it in my locker room in secret, but like I really love the transition from that into Boulevard of Broken Dreams. I also love the version of Holiday on their 2011 album, Awesome as Fuck.
Okay.
Where they have pyros going off, where he screams bang bang. I also really love the song Saint Jimmy, but that song, Give Me Novocaine, I just said that I'm not a huge fan of those slow songs, but Give Me Novocaine, that's a hard hitting track. It's a slow song and it hits hard in all the right spots, especially like if you're feeling any sort of depressed, because you don't want to feel anything. You just want to go numb. And yet all you can feel is pain, and all you want is Novocaine. It's a great song for my emo little heart. I love that song so much.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that the singles are all good. They're definitely there. I think Saint Jimmy is one of my favorite tracks off this. I think it's I don't know, there's something about that song. I like how it I don't know if it's the start of the second half of the album. Is, it's track 6, so it kind of is that dividing spot between, side A and side B, and it's whether it closes down side A or it starts side B. Although this might be I have it on vinyl. I should have pulled it out. I'm really smart. It's a great way to kind of transition to the second half of this album. And so I really, really like St. Jimmy. And then I've said it before, those 2 9-minute songs, to me, they're the heart of this album, and they're both so well done. And I don't listen to a whole lot of playlists. I tend to be an album guy, and this is such a great example of an album that is just so good front to back. There's not a bad song on this, and it's no skip for me as well. It just works.
It does. And I think St. Jimmy is such a great track too, because whether your interpretation of the album is you're following along with the American Idiot and he meets St. Jimmy, or if you're picturing St. Jimmy is the American Idiot, whatever interpretation it is, that's where you're introduced to that character as the halfway mark. And it's almost like the American Idiot character has stumbled upon his new savior, his new recollection. He's been on the streets and man, things are getting tough. Well, here's St. Jimmy. Here's gonna, give you all sorts of awesome things to do and anarchy and punk rock names.
Yeah. No, I love it.
It's like a secondary hope. That's what it comes across as.
Sure. And I know Wake Me Up When September Ends gets a lot of jokes, and there's a lot of jokes that go on about that song. But when you go back and you hear the story about what it is, because it's a reference to his father passing away when he was like 10, like it is a heartfelt song. And like whatever you want to say about Billy Joel, I know he's had some immature moments since then, and well, probably before then as well. But man alive, that's a good song. I mean, that song does a good job of just articulating something. And that idea, that phrase of Wake Me Up When September Ends, it's a phrase that he's had since he was 10. I was listening to an interview, him talking about it. Like, that's pretty amazing to me that he had that, and he was probably in his 40s for sure when he wrote this album. So to hang on to that phrase for so long and then to be able to articulate it and put it into an album and make it fit with this whole cohesive unit, that's pretty solid songwriting, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
My name is Jimmy and you're better not wear out. Suicide commando that your mama talked about. King of the 43s I'm meant to represent. That need all and nothing of the establishment. On the patriot side of the denial. With the name child face on the textbook.
So somebody has not run into this album. So I know before you said you're not trying to pitch it to everyone, but let's say you had to. Somebody has not run into this. Why is this something that somebody should go check out if they never have, which I'm sure is not happening, but why would you say like, hey, this is worth it? And I know this is, again, we've talked about so many of these things, but what's your sales pitch on why this is worth going back and checking out and listening even to today, 20 years later?
Because of its history within rock and roll. If anything, it just kind of boils down to that. Like its significance as a timepiece, it really holds up well. It's just genuinely great music. Like if you want to listen to any Green Day, this is definitely the one to go through first. It's either this one or Dookie. They've got 2 different sounds that represent the band very well.
Yeah. Before I give my sales pitch, I do want to acknowledge a couple things. One is, I will say, this is going to sound harsh, but like we have seen some, I want to say, immaturity from Billy Joel specifically, maybe the other ones too. And I know there's been some addiction stuff going on. And I want to just kind of acknowledge that like, we're not just ignoring or excusing some of those things. Cause like there's been a couple very public, blow ups, and I don't know what they're around or, what they're all about, but I think that's worth just acknowledging that like they have had some of those, and we're not just being like, oh, those are no big deal. But I think there still can be an appreciation for this album and this group, even despite those. And I also do want to acknowledge, I have not connected a ton with a lot of Green Day post this. 21st Century Breakdown I think is good. I liked Revolution Radio. A lot of the stuff has not been, a lot of their other stuff has just not hit for me. And it almost feels like there's been a little bit of chasing that's been happening since this album, that they've been kind of trying to chase almost the magic of this album. So I want to throw that out there as like a caveat, just because I feel like it's worth it. And then I will say the one thing that is really interesting about this album is that there's a couple moments where the language is interesting to talk to. And it's not the cursing, but it's his use of the word faggot, which is it's interesting to know. I don't know if somebody who's seen them recently, if he still uses it. I know he's using it satirically, but there's also like a, there's a tension there with using that word, because it is such an offensive word to be coming out of, his mouth. And I know he's using it to prove a point, but then they also use the word retarded, which is also really interesting. I think they use that one in Jesus of Suburbia. So it's also really interesting to look back at the language that they used 20 years ago. So those are some of my caveats.
That also coincides with the whole, it's a timepiece, because that's just kind of how people talked back then. I vividly remember people were talking like that when I was outside of my little church bubble. Like, I was hearing that. And then as I've grown older and I've revisited movies from the early 2000s, faggot and retard have been just thrown around all the time, everywhere. Now we know better. Now we're a little more sensitive to that, because those are not great words to be using. But they have their power, and I do believe he is still singing them when he plays them live, especially on this last tour. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, pretty sure. There's an asterisk there with some with some slight doubt. Yeah. But I also do agree with the whole Green Day chasing the high of American Idiot ever since its release. I'll always have like a soft spot for 21st Century Breakdown, just because that was the first Green Day album that I got into. I really love that. But I can also recognize there's some pretty bad songs on that one. The Uno Dos Tres trilogy, I know that wasn't very well received, but again, I have a really soft spot in my heart because those all came out while I was in high school. Okay. Definitely had way more songs than was necessary. It really could have been cut down to just one album, just a lengthy album. That Demolicious release that they had for a record store day a few years after the trilogy, that is what the trilogy should have been. All the songs that were on that Demolicious, those were the best ones, and they sounded really solid because they were like in a raw mix. Revolution Radio was kind of mid. There were like 2 good songs on that really stood out to me. Father of All was very experimental for them. If anything, it was very disappointing as a release. But their latest album, Saviors, that was actually pretty good. It seemed like they were very heavily inspired by the nostalgia of American Idiot and Insomniac. It almost seems like they were trying to channel that energy once again. And honestly, it was pretty solid. And out of all of their most recent releases, that's the one that I've been like, you know what, this is pretty good. But again, like, how do you follow up 3 solid albums, 1 flop, and then a mega rock opera? You follow it up with a second rock opera. How do you follow up a second rock opera? You don't. You know that the next few projects are going to be disappointing, and that's exactly what happened. They tried their best with the triple gimmick, and then they just couldn't hit that mark. So now I think they're starting to figure out, okay, this is the rails, this is the street we need to be going down now. Like they've kind of refigured it out.
And I totally agree. The last one is by far the high watermark of the last cycle of albums. Yeah. I think of that Uno Dos Tres album, that for me reminds me a lot of Sandinista. I've made this reference 2 episodes in a row, but it reminds me a lot of Sandinista by The Clash, where I love The Clash, but that album is ridiculous. I mean, it's 2.5 hours long. There's a song where it's just some kids singing. It's totally out of control. And if you cut that album down to 12 to 15 songs, it's amazing. It could potentially rival London Calling as their best album, but it can't, because it's 2.5 hours and it's just too long. So Uno Dos Tres always reminds me of Sandinista. So
yeah, agreed.
For me, I will say too, why this is worth going back to though, is that one of the cool things I like about it, and we've kind of touched on this, is that if you want to see a band brilliantly resurrect their career, this is it. You can put this on. You got to think about, like, they were waning from the height of pop culture. They had the, oh man, I can't believe I'm going to forget the song that's on the close of every sitcom.
Good Riddance.
Yes, Good Riddance. Thank you. So sorry.
At the end of Seinfeld.
So they had the height of, they had Dookie was a huge hit, and that was a huge hit that kind of put them back in the cultural zeitgeist. And then they had waned a little. And if you want to see a band resurrect their career, this is it. And that's pretty amazing to see them do it so successfully, to take this huge swing and have it work on, I think, on every level. So that's a reason too. Like, I like the time capsule. I like that it's iconic, but I also think If you want to see a band do that, this is the album to kind of go back and realize that this put them back on the map and put them as a stage one, number one rock and roll band in the world. This album did it. Because, yeah, it went to number one on the charts. So
Anything's possible if you put your mind to it, George.
Or if you write a good enough rock opera. Anything is possible.
Has come at last. The innocent can never last. Wake me up when September ends. Ring out the bells again, like we did when spring began. Wake me up when September ends.
That's our breakdown of American Idiot by Green Day. Again, released September 21st, 2004, celebrating a 20-year anniversary. Robert, where can people find you, not only online, but where can people find you on the radio? Because I know you do some radio work as well.
I do a lot of radio work. That's my whole career. I mean, if people are listening locally, it's 92.5 FM in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I host the afternoons from 2 o'clock to 6 o'clock every single weekday. If you're not local, there's the Big Country KTWB app. But I'm also on Instagram. It's at Robert Music Collection. I have deleted my Twitter app, so I'm not on there. I didn't delete my account, but I'm not active on there anymore.
I've noticed that. I'm sad.
So it's just Instagram mainly. I mean, I have a Blue Sky and I have a Threads. I think the Threads is connected to the Instagram, and I do believe that Blue Sky is under Green Hawk. I think I also have a TikTok too. I like to watch videos on there. I think that's also under Green Hawk. No, my Blue Sky is Robbie990, ROBEE 990. And then my TikTok is Green Hawk. And I like
Okay.
that. I like that tag, Green Hawk. It's a badge of honor being called Green Hawk by Mike Herrera. I'm never going to let that down.
No, and you shouldn't. I think it's a great fitting name, because if somebody follows you on Instagram, they'll see you've mostly got a. Does it change colors occasionally, or is it mostly green all the time? The mohawk.
Green's the main staple, but I've had blue, orange, pink,
Okay.
red. Yeah, I've had a few colors.
And you absolutely are a great follow on Instagram. I love seeing the music collection. Sometimes it's not just vinyl; it's multiple different versions of albums. So a great follow on Instagram.
I'm big onto
in my opinion.
CDs. I love CDs. I have a lot of vinyl, but I'm a big CD head.
CD revival. It's come up on this show before that people are getting back into it. So
Good. We need more CD releases. I'm sick of these vinyl only. Give me some CDs. I'll buy
Yep.
both, but I want the CD more than anything.
Well, I still have a CD player in my car, so that's why I buy stuff primarily to listen to CD in my car, because
There you go.
I really like that experience. I don't know if it makes me just feel nostalgic. Like, I have a minivan because, again, I have 4 kids, and I hate that the only way to connect to it is Bluetooth into it or connect
Yeah,
it.
that's the worst. It
hate
doesn't
it.
sound good.
Yep, it's trash. And then all it takes is one little problem with your phone or the connection, and then you're just sitting there listening to nothing. Oh, I hate it. Awesome, man. Well, I can't say thanks enough for joining me. I was really excited to talk about this album, and I'm glad we got to finally connect and have you on the show. I'm so thankful you could be on the show, and yeah, thanks so much. I'm super excited.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for finally having me. This has been a blast. Feel free to
Awesome.
ask me to come back on any other time. I'm happy to talk music as much as possible. You'd be surprised. I know a lot of little details about a lot of things.
That's what I'm looking for, is somebody who can bring some insights to albums and then just that personal connection. I love the story of kind of finding this in the hiding in the gym as you kind of discover this. I think that's fantastic. Awesome. Thanks so much, man.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Album Anniversary Podcast. I want to say thanks again to Robert for joining me to talk about American Idiot by Green Day. It was great to have him on the show. He's a great follow on Instagram, and I love hearing about why these albums are important to him. The story of him hiding in the locker room with his iPod Nano, listening to this album, just great stuff. Thanks again, Robert, for joining the show. Go check him out on Instagram and any of those other social medias. But Instagram, he's a great follow on there. Let us know what you thought. What did we get right? What did we get wrong? What are your favorites from this album? You can find me on Twitter at KalebTheSpy, no spaces. I'm also on Instagram, KalebTheSpy, with underscores in between the words. You can also email me at KalebTheSpyPodcasts@gmail.com. That's with an S at the end. No spaces or underscores in that. If there are albums that should be on my calendar because they were celebrating, let me know. I'll try and get them added. If you'd like to join the show, the easiest way to do that is to follow me on Twitter. I try and throw out albums that I want to do on the show that are coming up, that are celebrating these big anniversaries. I'll throw it out there if I'm looking for a guest, if I don't have somebody in mind already, or somebody hasn't already talked to me about it. And just respond to that, and we'll try and hook up and try and make it happen. Please subscribe and share the podcast if you're so inclined. Leave a rating or review. I have heard it is an effective way to spread the word about podcasts. Most of all, I do want to say thanks if you engage with me at all on social media. I put a lot of time and energy into setting up those daily posts, so seeing people get excited to revisit or discover older albums is always a thrill. If you enjoy this show, you might also enjoy the other show I do with my friend Scott. It's called I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. It's not just a podcast where we reminisce about our youth, but we were going back and trying to interview 90s youth group kids and some 2000 kids and kind of find out where they're at now, whether they've left the church entirely or they're still at the church they were raised in. We want to understand how that youth group experience has impacted their lives. The music at the beginning and the end of this show is the instrumental version of the song Sing It Out at Street Level by Peg and the Rejected. Thanks again, and we will talk to you soon. Go talk to your internet friends. Props to my parents on Where Zero Meets 15 when I was, I'm a senior by that point when that one comes out. And we were on a family trip and we're going an hour north of Denver as we're like heading off to something else. And I was like, man, I'd love to go down to Where Zero Meets 15 in downtown Denver. And my parents did it. They took an hour detour, probably 2-hour detour. We went downtown Denver. They found a place to park, let me get out and take pictures around where the Zero Meets 15 at Colfax and Broadway.
That is awesome.
Yeah, it's, again, my parents, props to them. They have always let me embrace the weirdness and the obsession stuff, partially because my dad's obsessed with Bob Dylan. So I think he kind of gets it. So
that's awesome. Yeah, my wife and I, we wrote down all the locations from the Wonder Years 3 trilogy albums, okay. Upsides, Suburbia, and Greatest Generation. We went through, and my parents drove us around downtown Philadelphia and Lansdale, Pennsylvania. And we went sightseeing and we got to see all those Wonder Years landmarks where they filmed the music videos, mentions of, talked about the cover of their 7-inch, so on and so forth. And we got to do all that. That was really cool.
That's awesome. Yeah. I hope we do a lot of it. We ship kids around because we've got teenagers. And so like, we're trying to push hard. Like if you want to do something, you just got to tell us, and we may not be able to make it work, but man, we'll try because
that's cool.
We want to take you to my one son got really into bonsai trees, and it's a huge time commitment, but it's like, all right, we'll try and make it work, man. I'm glad you're into it. So him and a bunch of retired people. So. All right. Heading into so let me try again.